Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're really going to have to use our Hebrew eyes to understand what's going on in Mark chapter 5, which is the gospel reading for this coming Sunday, because we have two situations that have to do with ritual uncleanness. And one of these is ritual uncleanness due to death, and one of these is ritual uncleanness due to blood. But to understand both of these, we kind of have to put ourselves back in the ritual mindset that was dictated, for instance, by Leviticus in the Old Testament. So what I want to do is, first of all, bring to our awareness the fact that we still, as modern people, we still have these ideas of clean and unclean, of pure and impure, even though we usually don't really stop to think about it. So I'm going to give you some examples, and then we're going to transition from that into talking about more of the Leviticus ideas of what is clean and unclean. And the first of these has to do with a Dixie cup. So if I ask you to spit into a Dixie cup and then to drink it, chances are you'd be like, no way, that's gross. Why would I do that? Now think about that for a minute. Every day, all day, you are swallowing the saliva in your mouth. We all do that. We just don't think about it. It's a completely natural action. So our saliva in our mouth, we consider to be clean. But as soon as we put that saliva in a cup, so outside our bodies, and then think about drinking it, all of a sudden now it's gross, it's unclean. But there's really no difference whatsoever in the saliva. Another example. Say it's a hot summer day, and I offer you a cold glass of lemonade. Well, chances are you're going to take it, you're going to drink it, you won't think anything about it. It's great. But if I, and hang with me here, if I hand you a bedpan, now this bedpan is completely sterile, it's never been used, straight from the manufacturer, and this bedpan has yellow lemonade in it, and I ask you to drink that lemonade out of that bedpan, chances are, again, you're going to say, no, that's disgusting, that's gross, why would I do that? Why? It's just a different receptacle. One's a glass, one's a bedpan. They're both clean, both lemonade, but because of the connections that we have with bedpans and, of course, the color yellow, we consider one to be clean, one to be unclean. Okay, one more example. So if you have a significant other, if you're married, so you have a spouse, or if you're dating someone, you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, chances are you kiss them on the mouth. Perhaps you passionately kiss them. And this seems to us quite natural. It's clean. However, would you share their toothbrush? If you've been married 10 or 20 or 50 years, chances are you'd say, no, I'm not going to share my toothbrush. But think about it. It's okay to kiss them on the mouth, but it seems gross or unclean to use someone else's toothbrush. Now, all these drive really home the same point, that we still think of things in terms of categories, ritual sort of categories of clean and unclean, of pure and impure. Even though from a completely rational, objective point of view, there's no difference, for instance, in drinking lemonade from a glass or drinking lemonade from that clean bedpan. One is gross and one is not. And even though the saliva in my mouth that I swallow doesn't seem gross to me, but if I put the saliva outside my body and drink it, it seems disgusting. Now, why? Now, our modern conceptions are in one way kind of like Leviticus, because one of the things you see in Leviticus is that as soon as something like blood, for instance, crosses a border, in this case, a bodily border, it goes outside the body, it passes from being clean to unclean. And it's kind of like that with us. So if you look at me, if you look at yourself, you look at other people, you know that inside our bodies, we have all sorts of bodily fluids. We have urine in our bladders, we have feces in our intestines, we have blood in our veins, we've got saliva in our mouth. But if we look at other people, we don't think, oh, that's gross, because all that stuff is inside. But as soon as it passes the border of the body, as soon as it goes outside the body in urine or feces or blood or saliva, all of a sudden it's gross, it's unclean. Well, it was kind of like that with some aspects of cleanness and uncleanness in Leviticus. So, for instance, a woman always has blood in her body, but when she's on her menstrual cycle, then it is unclean. She's in a state of ritual uncleanness. A man always has semen in his body, but if he has a seminal emission, then he too is unclean for a period of time. So there is this idea of things leaving the border of the body that puts one into a state of ritual uncleanness. Now, of course, our categories today, those of Leviticus, are not the same, but my point, the point I'm trying to get across, is that even though Leviticus seems to us a weird and a foreign world, it's actually not that different from the way that we still view things today. Okay? Now, kind of bearing all that in mind, I want to take a look just briefly at kind of the structure of Mark chapter 5, this section we're going to be dealing with, and then we're going to transition to kind of the ritual worldview of the Old Testament mind and use that as a means by which we can better understand what's going on in Mark chapter 5 when Jesus heals one woman and raises a young girl back to life. And in both cases, confronts ritual impurity, one in the case of blood, one in the case of death. Okay, so this is the way that the whole structure is set up. This is going to be Mark chapter 5, and it's verses 21 through 43. It's a sandwich structure. So you can kind of picture two slices of bread with the meat in the middle. So the two slices of bread have to do with Jesus going to the home of Jairus, whose daughter is seriously ill. That's verses 21 through 24. And then we pick that story back up at verse 35 when Jesus gets to her home and touches the dead girl, speaks to her, and restores her to life. And in between these two textual slices, if you will, is what we have is the story we have with the woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years, who sneaks up behind Jesus, touches his cloak, and is healed. Now, in both these cases, we have these ritual categories of uncleanness because of blood and uncleanness because of death. Now, the Hebrew word that's kind of in the background here is tameh, which is the word for unclean. So if you look in Leviticus 15:19, we see that when a woman has a discharge, that is a discharge during her cycle, and she's going to be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, so whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. That's because in the Old Testament mind, uncleanness was like a contagion. You catch it from somebody. So if you touch someone who's unclean, you yourself catch that uncleanness and you become unclean. And then Numbers 19:11 says, whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. So blood renders one unclean, death renders one unclean as well. Now, what is meant by uncleanness? And how do you get out of uncleanness? And how does this all work with regard to sin and sanctification and issues like that? Now, this is all kind of the necessary background for grasping the full significance of what Jesus does when he lets this woman touch him and doesn't rebuke her, but says, shalom, peace to you. And it's also in the background when Jesus touches a dead body, when he touches the corpse of the young girl and restores her back to life. So let's kind of get in our heads the ritual worldview that's in the background, and this comes from the book mainly of Leviticus. So if you look on the slide here, you see that basically you have what's called the human realm, and things in the human realm are clean and they're common, all right? Now let's add to this. So you've got not only the human realm, but you've also got God's realm. And things in God's realm are clean, but they're also holy. That is, they've moved over from that middle realm to God's realm. And you can think of things like the gold that was used in the tabernacle, or the sacrificial animals that entered into the tabernacle and were sacrificed, or the bread products that were brought into the tabernacle. All of these are clean and common, but they transition from one sphere, the human sphere, into God's sphere or God's realm. Now, things can also go the opposite direction, and this you might call the inhuman realm. Things here are common and unclean. And this would involve all the kind of uncleanness we've been talking about, whether uncleanness because one came in contact with a corpse, or uncleanness because one had a seminal emission, or a woman was on her menstrual cycle, or any number of other things could render someone ritually unclean in the Old Testament. And people were, for the most part, kind of moving back and forth between these, especially the two realms to the right, the human realm and the inhuman realm. Now, on one end of this, you've got the divine presence. So in the Old Testament, holiness was thought of architecturally or locationally. That is to say, holiness was God. God alone is holy. He's the only one who possesses intrinsically and essentially holiness. So the angels sing, "Holy, holy, holy," in Isaiah chapter 6. He is the only one who in himself is holy. And so the more something moves close to him, the holier it becomes. So there are degrees of holiness in the Old Testament. That's why we have the language of Holy of Holies and holy place. The closer something is to the presence of God, the holier it becomes. That also means that the farther away something is, the less holy it becomes. And if it moves all the way into the unclean category, it's what you might think of as the divine absence. So you got divine presence, you've got divine absence. And the movement here is from purification to sanctification. So something is going toward the divine presence, it's made clean, it's purified, and then it's made holy, it's sanctified. And the opposite of that can also happen. Something which is in the kind of the human realm can be profaned, and then it can become unclean or defiled. So kind of get this whole picture into your head, because this is crucial for understanding so much of what's going on in the Old Testament, and then this goes over into the New Testament as well. Now we're going to talk in a second about how Jesus alters this. Jesus radically alters this because he's going to change the location of divine holiness from the temple to his own body. And he's also going to interiorize evil, because evil is, or uncleanness. Uncleanness is no longer going to be something which is, for instance, in an unclean animal, such as unclean food, or in the bodily kinds of emissions that we've been talking about, but instead, Jesus is going to interiorize uncleanness within the human heart. Okay, with all that as sort of the background, let's look at what's going on, especially in this middle story about the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. So a great crowd followed Jesus. They thronged about him, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. So she heard the reports about Jesus, came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. Now we're going to come back to that in a minute, because Matthew and Luke specify which part of his garment that she touched. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see who had done it, and the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace," or go in shalom, "and be healed of your disease." By the way, that is the only time in the Gospels when Jesus refers to a woman as daughter. So this singles her out as a special case, as one to whom the Lord shows mercy. Now, this particular woman was in this constant state of impurity, of course, because she had been hemorrhaging for off and on, or perpetually, whatever her physical condition was, for 12 years. So she would fall in the category, an unusual, in this case, category of what was referred to as nidah, which was the Hebrew term for the menstrual cycle. So she was in this state of ritual impurity, and she comes up behind Jesus and she touches his garment. Or as Matthew and Luke have it, she touched the fringe of his garment. Now this is fascinating. So in Mark, she just touched his himation, which is the general Greek word for his outer cloak. Matthew and Luke says she touched the fringe, the kraspedon, the edge or the fringe of his garment. Now, the reason this is fascinating, if you go back to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, you'll see that the Greek word used to translate the tzitzit is kraspedon. Now, what are the tzitzit? The tzitzit are these fringes that hang from the four corners of the Israelites' garments. You can read about those in Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 through 39. And these are there on their garments as kind of an icon, a visual reminder that they're the Lord's people, they belong to Him, and that they are part of His covenant people. So she was touching that particular tzitzit, that particular tassel hanging down from his garment, because this was, of course, what any pious Jew would have been wearing in the first century. So Jesus had these on as well. And so that's what the woman touches. It was kind of a sign of royalty, you might think. This is a way that the Israelites, by the very clothing they wore, were giving evidence that they were connected to the covenant of God. Now, I want to come back to her and everything that just happened with her in just a minute, but let's fast forward to what happens after she's healed, when Jesus goes into the house where the 12-year-old girl has died and is now a corpse. So picking up there, Jesus goes on, he shoos everybody out of the house, and he goes inside with just the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and they go to where the child was at. And Jesus, now this is important, takes her by the hand. Now keep in mind, she's dead. This isn't a girl who's just sick. She is now a corpse. So Jesus is touching the hand of a girl who is, because she's a corpse, is ritually impure, which, according to the technicalities of the law, would have rendered him ritually impure. And we'll come back to that. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, now this is an Aramaic phrase, talitha kum, or talitha kumi. This means, as it's translated here, little girl, I say to you, arise. And what happens? Well, immediately the girl got up and began walking. She was 12 years of age. Of course, this 12 joins these two stories together. The woman was hemorrhaging for 12 years. This girl is 12 years old. And they immediately were overcome with amazement. Now this is, I think I talked about this in last week's video, this is the climax of these demonstrations of Jesus' exousia, his authority and power. He shows that when he heals people, he shows that exousia, that power and authority, when he rebukes the winds and the waves and calms the storm. Right before this was last week's reading. And now he's finally displaying his exousia, his power or his authority, in speaking words which vivify the dead. Speaking words which give life to one who has died. So this is a preview of his own resurrection, by which he is going to finally overcome death once and for all of us. So this little girl's bringing to life again is a picture of what is to happen to our Lord. Now let's kind of put all this together. We have Jesus, who is confronted with uncleanness connected with blood, uncleanness connected with death. And in both these situations, he overcomes this impurity or this uncleanness. In one case, the woman who's unclean touches him, so this is sort of involuntary on his part. In the other case, he actively, voluntarily touches the girl who has died. Now, I think what's going on here we can kind of sum up in 3 or 4 different points. The first of these is this. Jesus redefines and relocates holiness within himself. He is a walking, talking, healing, resurrecting tabernacle or temple. The holiness of God, which up to this point, up to the incarnation of Jesus, had been in the Holy of Holies, is now in him. He is the peripatetic Holy of Holies. He is the walking Holy of Holies, so that when people come into contact with him, they come into contact with sanctification incarnate. So when this woman who had been hemorrhaging touches him, that's almost the equivalent of her walking into the Holy of Holies itself and not being destroyed, but instead hearing a word, shalom, be healed, go in peace, be whole again from the very Lord who has come to save her. So Jesus relocates holiness within his own person, which of course is where our holiness is still located, in the body of Jesus Christ. Secondly, he interiorizes uncleanness within the human heart. So Jesus says, you know, what makes you unclean isn't what you put in your mouth. It's not the food that you eat. It's what comes out of the heart. Because out of the heart comes murders and adulteries and evil thoughts and all the other kinds of sewage that characterizes sinners. So one thing that Jesus does in his ministry is he's moving these categories of uncleanness from outside or from something you put in your body to that which is in the heart. That is the realm of uncleanness, is within the human heart, because it's from here that comes defilement and sin of every sort. And then, thirdly, according to the strict interpretation of the law, Jesus is taking on uncleanness. And Matthew reflects this. Matthew chapter 8:17 quotes Isaiah 53, where he says, "He himself," that is, Jesus himself, "took on our infirmities and carried away our diseases." So, already in the ministry of Jesus, what is he doing? He is acting in a Good Friday sort of way. He's taking on humanity's uncleanness. He's taking on humanity's sicknesses and ailments. And in the case of this little girl, and later in the case of Lazarus, he's taking on death itself. He, as a Christological sponge, if you will, is soaking in the uncleanness of the world in order that when he gets on the cross, all this work will be fulfilled. All the uncleanness, all the death, all the sin, all of the evil of the world will be funneled into him and him alone, so that it's only in him. There will be no sin except what is in Jesus. There will be no uncleanness except what is in Jesus. There will be no death except what is in Jesus. So that when he dies and prefaces his death by saying, "Tetelestai," it is finished, it truly will be finished. Because he will have taken all of this into himself and then taken it into the grave, where he leaves it for good by exiting on the day of resurrection in order to bring life and purity and sanctification to the world, as the world is connected to him, to his body, which is now the locus of holiness, the location of sanctification for all of us. Well, as always, I hope that walking through all of this has given you a better perspective exactly what's going on in the Gospels. As we read these through Hebrew eyes, we have to let these eyes be formed by the Old Testament, by books like Leviticus. And we also saw in those examples I gave at the beginning that we still kind of think in these same categories. So anyway, that's a quick run through Mark chapter 5 with all of this kind of background material. I pray it's helpful to all of you, whether you're just hearing this text preach or whether you're preaching it yourself. And I pray that God's peace and his shalom, his wholeness may be yours, as well as his sanctifying grace for each and every one of you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.